Even before this panel started, I think I learned two important things this morning. One is that I'm somewhat handicapped because I don't drink coffee, so I'm not waiting for it to kick in. I'm very handicapped in that sense. And the other thing is that I apparently been diagnosed with a big case of holy envy, which I didn't even know that I had, but that really resonated with me. So now for something a little bit different. I am here representing my organization, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. So let me just take half a minute to tell you who we are, because I'm representing the great work of a combination of my colleagues. We were founded in 2002, and our vision is imagining a truly pluralistic America where Muslims are strong and equal participants. And we work towards this vision by conducting research that empowers the American Muslim community to contribute, develop, and innovate. What do we mean by that? Through conducting and sharing our research, we catalyze community development. We increase inclusion and participation by amplifying the voices of American Muslims and by building bridges between communities. And we inspire forward thinking by providing platforms for open dialogue and debate and food for thought. So we're not so focused on philanthropy per se, we're focused on research that empowers the American Muslim community. And I would be remiss without mentioning my colleagues who actually, for the most part, authored this work, and that is my research director, Dalia Mogahed, and our research analyst, Fouad Pervez. So what I'm going to present to you today is an evidence-based snapshot of the American Muslim community that was based on our survey of Muslims, Jews, Catholics, and Protestants in America. It was done as part of our efforts to inform voters during this election cycle, so you'll see that a lot of the questions very much relate to what's going on during this election cycle. So what does that actually have to do with this conference? Why am I standing here? I think there's a couple of important reasons why this snapshot is worth considering in the context of philanthropy. First, it provides a snapshot of the American Muslim community, and I don't think you can talk about Muslim giving without understanding who Muslims in this country actually are. And this hints at some of the attitudes, beliefs, and practices of the community. The second reason I think it's important with regards to philanthropy is that it gives us important data points on both civic and political engagement, and that hints at philanthropic engagement as well. And the third reason why I think this is important is that it hints both at the giving potential and capacity of the community, as well as gaps where philanthropic dollars could well be spent. The topics we included in this survey include politics, religion, identity, and tolerance for violence. So all of those things that your parents probably told you not to talk about in polite dinner company or elsewhere. I'm not going to go deep into the methodology, just to say that we conducted this survey asking the same questions across the faith groups. We conducted the survey the last 2 weeks of January, so it was 8 months ago. And it is all of the samples of Muslims, Jews, Catholics, and Protestants are nationally representative samples, mostly random sampling. So the first point I want to make is that Muslims in America are the most ethnically diverse faith community. There is no majority race. It's the only faith community with no majority race. There's an equal percentage that are African American, Asian, white, and Arab. And it's important to note that the Latino community is actually the fastest growing segment of the Muslim community. In 2009, Latinos made up just 3% of the American Muslim landscape. Now they're at 6% of that community. And really, Muslims are sort of a microcosm of what America will look like in 30 years, when there will no be majority race. The other demographic that's important to note is that Muslims are the youngest faith group that we surveyed. 36% of Muslims in America are under the age of 35. And this is compared to Catholics where 26% are under the age of 35, and Protestants where 24% are under the age of 35. So Muslims are diverse, and they tend to be young. I don't have a slide on economics, but I think in terms of this gathering, economics are a really important data point. And Muslims are indeed more as likely as Protestants and Catholics to make more than $75,000 a year. And there is sort of a perception about within the American Muslim community that Muslims tend to be fairly well off, that there are a lot of professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, professional people who work. But the reality is that a sizable percentage of the Muslim community are at or below the poverty line. And this is not something that's even widely understood within the Muslim community. 38% of American Muslims have a pre-tax annual household income of $30,000 or less. 38%. This compares to 32% of Protestants, 22% of Catholics, and 17% of Jews. And poverty among American Muslims is often overlooked. This is obviously critical when we're talking about philanthropy, that there's a serious need here and maybe a big gap. This slide, we're moving into the politics realm. This slide is somewhat outdated. Obviously, we now only have 2 presidential candidates. When we asked the question, we had many, many more. But I think there's 2 important things to note on this slide. We asked people, if the election were held tomorrow, who would you vote for? And the Muslim community overwhelmingly supported Hillary. In fact, Hillary had her biggest support amongst the Muslim community. And Bernie Sanders also had a very sizable amount of support. Trump had his lowest support amongst Muslims. And I think this slide is important because obviously there are lots of stereotypes about every community, and 2 stereotypes that are very unfortunate that plague the Muslim community. One is that there's an issue around women, and 2 is that there are relationship challenges between Jews and Muslims. And I think this is important because Hillary and Bernie, the woman and the Jewish candidate, are the people that had absolutely by far the highest support amongst Muslim voters. Muslims, very much like Jews, are most likely to identify as Democrat. 44% of Muslims say they affiliate with the Democratic Party. I think the important thing to note about political affiliation is that Muslims have the largest percentage of independents, people who don't find a home in either political party. And that's not totally surprising. Many Muslims are possibly more socially conservative, at least a percentage of the Muslim community are socially conservative. It might align them with the Republican Party, but the rhetoric that comes out of the party makes them distance themselves from that party. So thus the large number of independents. When we asked people what their top priority was for the next president, for Muslims, it was economy and jobs, which isn't surprising because of both the wealth and the poverty within the community, civil rights and fighting bigotry, and education. And this mirrored very similarly to Democrats and most similarly to the African American community. And this isn't surprising that bigotry and civil rights comes up as the second most important thing to deal with, because Muslims by far suffer the most discrimination. 1 out of 5 Muslims in this country reported that they had experienced religious-based discrimination in the past year. And unfortunately, the people who suffer most from this are people who are probably the most vulnerable and the least likely to be able to deal with it. Women, young people who may not be established in their careers yet or may not have social support that they need, and those with less education. Again, they may not have the sort of economic power to fight some of this bigotry. Interestingly, though, Muslims who report religious discrimination, those who report regular discrimination, while not surprisingly, they are less satisfied with the direction of this country. They're actually more civically engaged. They are more likely to participate in community activities and to solve problems in conjunction with their neighbors. I'm going to skip over some of these slides or go quickly because I realize my time is running out. Muslims are the most satisfied with the direction of the country across the faith groups and with President Obama, and I think this is directly reflective of Obama's very inclusive rhetoric and his real attempts at including Muslims within the political space. So, civic and political engagement. Muslims, as well as every other faith group, are about 40% of people are likely to coordinate with their neighbors to solve a community problem. So civic engagement seems to be the same across the faith groups that we surveyed. Where there is a real difference, however, is in political engagement. Muslims are registered to vote in far fewer numbers. Just 60% of Muslims were registered to vote at this time, compared to almost 90 or more than 90% of every other faith group. And 85% of Muslims said they planned to vote, compared to nearly 100% of all the other faith groups. I think two things are really important here. One is that there is an enormous gap. 25% of Muslims said they planned to vote, but were not registered. We're calling these voters the Insha'Allah voters, that somehow magically, when it comes to election day, they will vote Insha'Allah. But so there's a huge gap here in terms of registering these people to vote and actually get them to the polls. I think also it's really important to note that 15% of Muslim Americans are not planning to vote. And this is a problem. This is far larger percentage than any other faith group. When we ask people why they weren't planning to vote, the main reasons were a lack in belief of efficacy of their vote. They just don't believe their vote matters. They don't trust any of the candidates. They just don't want to be part of a system that they feel is rigged and has led to bloodshed or other things that they're not comfortable with. I'm going to skip. When we talk about religion, Muslims are very similar to Protestants in terms of the importance of religion to their daily lives and also the frequency of attendance at religious centers. Something like 42% of Muslims say they attend a religious service either once a week or more frequently. So that obviously hints at the huge importance of the mosques and community centers to the daily life of Muslims in this country. And if I go back to this slide, frequent mosque attendance, so people who attended the mosque once a week or more, tend to be more civically engaged and more politically engaged. They tend to cooperate with their neighbors more, they're more likely to be registered to vote, and they're more likely to plan to vote. When it comes to identity, there's often this hint that you can't be both Muslim and American. I don't know why that's even an issue, but it's come up many times in the rhetoric, and that is just not the case. We asked separately about, do you feel American? Do you feel Muslim? And we asked across the faith groups, and there is no difference. People feel both religious and American, and that's the same for Muslims. There's absolutely no trade-off here. You don't have to decrease one to be the other. And actually, people with stronger religious identities tended to have stronger American identities. So those who felt more Muslim also felt more American. And that indicates the buy-in which people have for building institutions, nonprofits, and other things in this country. And lastly, I believe, when we talk about tolerance for violence, this is another issue that just comes up over and over and over again. It's like whack-a-mole, you target it and then it comes up again. But there's this sort of belief that Muslims somehow are, with everything that's going on with ISIS, somewhat accepting of what's going on. That is absolutely not the case. We asked across faith groups whether military attacks against civilians were justified ever. And whether individual attacks against civilians were ever justified. By individual attacks, we were trying to get at ISIS and these other groups. Across the board, people reject violence by individual groups against civilians. And actually, Muslims were far more likely to reject military violence against civilians. Military violence is a war crime, and Muslims were more likely to reject that violence. We looked at a whole bunch of crosstabs to look at whether religiosity, frequent mosque attendance, or anything like this affected the level of tolerance for violence. And there was no correlation. Doesn't matter how religious you are. None of this mattered. Across the board, people, for the most part, rejected violence. The one thing that did slightly matter in terms of looking at this was American identity. Muslims with a stronger American identity were more likely to reject violence against civilians. And I think this is really important because if what is happening now continues to happen, which is alienating Muslims from this American identity and somehow making them other, we're actually, policy-wise, making this country less safe. It's a bad political tactic. So people would be wise to learn from this. So I think that is it. Just to sum up, Muslims lean Democrat. Muslims are engaged in the community, but less politically. Muslims tend to be both pious and patriotic. Muslims reject attack on civilians. Mosque attendance is linked to civic engagement, not to radicalization. And Muslims are weary of discrimination, but optimistic of the direction of this country. Thank you.